In this lecture, we will be looking at Chapter 10, Modernist Representations, the Female Body. Now, this is a pretty dense chapter, so I would definitely recommend chunking it down, meaning read little sections at a time, maybe 15, 20 pages, then take a break, and then come back to it, so you don't get overwhelmed with all the information in the work. So in this chapter, what we're looking at is modern artists from Renoir, who stated, "I paint with my prick," to Picasso, who stated, "Painting, that is actual lovemaking," have collaborated in fusing the sexual and the artistic by equating artistic creation with male sexual energy, presenting women as powerless and sexually subjugated. In her article, Domination and Virility in Vanguard Painting, Carol Duncan states, "Reduced to flesh, the female subject is rendered powerless before the artist viewer, her body contorted according to the dictates of his erotic will. Instead of the consuming femme fatale, one sees an obedient animal." And Duncan's essay points to a very long history in which the representation of the female body has been organized for male viewing pleasure. The subject of the nude in art brings together discourses on representation, morality, female sexuality, but the persistent presentation of the nude female body as a site of male viewing pleasure, a commodified image of exchange, and a fetishized defense against the fear of castration has left little place for explorations of female subjectivity, knowledge, and experience. The difficulty of distinguishing between overtly sexualized and other forms of looking, the issue of female subjectivity, and the identification of the female body with nature, generation, and the instinctual life have become important areas of investigation for contemporary feminism. Marginalized in the aesthetic and political debate swirling around modern art movements in the early decades of the 20th century, many women turn to the female body as the primary subject of a woman's experience. As we become more conscious of the fact that we do not possess unedited access to our own bodies, that our understanding and conceptualization of the body is structured by discourses from those of art to medicine to law, the work of earlier generations of women artists who addressed the interaction of gender, class, artistic convictions, and the milieu of representations of the female body provides important precedents. Suzanne Valderon and Paula Monachon-Becker were two of the first women artists to work exclusively with the nude female form. And the image on the slide here is Valderon's reclining nude from 1928. Their paintings collude with and challenge narratives that construct female identity through connections to nature and that view women as controlled by emotions, sexual instincts, and biology. And so we'll start by looking at Suzanne Valderon. Her date's 1865 to 1938. And her powerful nude served her. Now we have to remember, she was not looked at as a respectable middle-class woman. But her powerful nude severed her from her femininity and allowed her to circulate as a pseudo-male, complete with masculine power and virility. Her status in the eyes of contemporary critics, though, was not sufficient to ensure her places in history of modern art. By 1920, her work was all but ignored. She became an artist model in early 1880s after working as a circus performer. She was part of the sexually free bohemian life of early 20th century Paris. Her entree into the world of art came through her identification with a class of sexually available artist models, an association which liberated her from any lingering expectations about respectability and allowed her to enter into easy relationships with other artists and with her patrons, which we seldom see in the careers of middle-class artists of those years. Her female nudes fuse observation with the knowledge of the female body based on her experiences as a model. She emphasizes context, specific movement, and physical action. She also emphasizes the awkward gestures of figures apparently in control of their own movements. Often she places her figures on specific domestic settings, surrounding them with images of domesticity and community. Works such as these represent a striking departure from the practices of her contemporaries. She often turned her bathers away from the viewer and depicted them absorbed in their own activities, as you see here. There is little or no attempt to establish the closely framed single point of visual connection between viewer and model. The nakedness of her figures is specific to the act of bathing. Her nudes are full-bodied, weighty, and sturdy. Although sensuous, they stand in opposition to the archetypal and furtive female figures so prevalent in the avant-garde circles of Gauguin and the Faux. Modest gains made by women in education and employment, though, in France at the end of the 19th century provoked an intense anti-feminist backlash. What we'll see is the colonization of the natural female body reinforced early modernist exaltation of the natural female body, always subject to the literal and metaphoric control of man. Among the work of women artists associated with Expressionism, that of Paula Mondersham-Becker and Kat Kollwitz most clearly reveal the clash between modern idealists and social reality. So we'll look at Paula Mondersham-Becker. Her date's 1876 to 1907. She was born in Dresden, Germany, to a comfortably middle-class parents who encouraged her artistic interests. In 1897, she made her first visit to the Wolfsverdier artists in Germany, in northern Germany, and she also began to study with Fritz Marxsen at that time. The Wolfsverdier artists embraced nature, the primitive simplicity of peasant life, and the purity of youth. Later, marrying the painter Otto Monderschen, she did not share the group's disdain for academic training. Flattened and symbolized forms mark her mature style and derive from the influence of French painters, particularly Cézanne and Gauguin. She ignored convention, perspective, and anecdotal detail to produce monumental image of idealized motherhood. Her diary records her own ambivalence towards marriage, motherhood, and art, though. Karl Scheffler's misogynistic work, Woman in Art, was published in 1908 after her death, but its sentiments were commonly accepted throughout the period of Mondersham-Becker's development as an artist. Scheffler emphasized women's inability to participate in the production of culture because of her ties and her lack of spiritual insight. Mondersham-Becker's own ambivalence on those points is recorded in an allegorical prose poem in which she acknowledges her artistic ambitions as masculine and remarks on the mutual exclusivity of sexual love and artistic success. Gradually reflecting the Wolfsverdier artist's commitments to crude naturalism, her work began to record influences from Rodin, Japanese art, Demure, Millet, and other French painters. So she's moving away from the Wolfsverdier artists. Her nude self-portraits may be the first such paintings in oil by a woman artist, but as such, they reveal all the contradictions inherent in the woman artist's attempt to insert her own image into existing artistic conventions. Her nudes dominate their surroundings. The immobility, monumentality, and generalized surfaces of these self-portrait nudes place them with conventions that work to universalize the female nude as a transcendental image. At the same time, the careful scrutiny of the female body, with its gravelly surfaces and the frank confrontation between the woman and the artist, disrupts the conventions of the female nude, fusing the issues of femaleness and creativity in new ways. Her archetypal fertility images of 1906 and 1907 clothe the subject of fertility and nurture with dignity, while at the same time collaborating with a late 19th century ideology of timeless, unvarying, natural womanhood. Her death a few days after giving birth provides an ironic commentary on the gulf between idealized motherhood and the biological realities of fertility. Now, it's Kat Kollwitz's depiction of women and children that insert motherhood into the bitterly concrete context of class and history. Kat Kollwitz's dates are 1867 to 1945, and she was committed to an art of radical social content unrivaled in her day. Her choice of graphic realism as her style and her exclusive use of printmaking media, along with her production of posters and humanitarian leaflets, all contributed to later devaluations of her work and its dismissal by art historians as illustrations and propaganda. She replaces the archetypal imagery of female abundance with the realities of female bodies marked by poverty, which often prevent women from nourishing their children or enjoying motherhood. She was the first woman elected to the Prussian Academy of Arts in 1909 and was the foremost graphic artist of the first half of the 20th century. She was encouraged to draw as a child by her father, and she studied in Berlin, Munich, and Kaliningrad. In 1891, she married Dr. Karl Kollwitz and settled in Berlin. A socialist, feminist, and pacifist, the themes of war, hatred, poverty, love, grief, death, and struggle dominate her mature work. She turned to themes of social conditions into the expressive mediums of engraving and lithography, both forms of printmaking. Her first major success came with a cycle of 3 engravings and 3 lithographs entitled The Weaver's Revolt from 1895 to 97, and one of these is in your textbook. She was appointed to teach graphic and nude studies at a school in Berlin. Her subsequent concentration on the mother and child theme developed hand in hand with a series of personal tragedies, which included the death of a son in World War I and a grandson in World War II. In the image I have here for you from 1903 of Woman and Dead Child is almost a little bit of foreshadowing, because the model that she used in this of the dead child was actually her own son, the same one who ended up dying in World War I. With the documenting the suffering that results from war and poverty, it led her away from the expressions of individual torment that mock the world of her contemporaries. She increasingly came to see expressionism as a rarefied art of the studio divorced from the social reality. Her insistence on the social function of art divorced her work from the modernist cultivation of individual artistic freedom. And then that's going to bring us to Gwen John, whose dates are 1876 to 1939. Now, she had little interest in theoretical aspects of the artistic movements, nor was she a joiner. Modernist movements also produced its own myths about her and as a woman artist. Until recently, she was most often presented as an unknown, but always in relation to masculine figures. She was born and raised in Wales and educated at the Slade School in London and worked in Whistler's studio. She went to France at age 27 and remained there for the rest of her life. Her work contains dry surfaces, restrained color, and patterned brushworks. Her paintings are muted in color, subdued in tone, informal in arrangement, and evoke powerful emotional responses. Their intimate scale and personal subjects have also helped fuel the widespread myth in which the woman artist's life is seen as providing the principal source of meaning for the work. She first exhibited in 1900 at the New English Art Club, and then after she returned to Paris. She supported herself by posing as an artist model, often for English women artists. Now, distinctive themes emerged in her work during this period, among them the simple interiors bathed in soft light and isolated female figures set against textured walls. By the summer of 1904, she was also posing for the artist Rodin, and her relationship with the sculptor belongs to the difficult history of women who, lacking familial and societal support for their endeavors, have annexed their talent to that of male mentors and have seen their own careers suffer as a result. Often as seen, the creative life is subsumed into a myth of romantic love in which the role of the muse eclipses that of artist. John's reflective, dedicated life allowed her to live largely independent of social obligations placed on most women of her class and historical period. However, she did not escape the critical search for what was considered the essentially feminine in her work. This and related terms have also been used to define categories within which to view the work of other women who moved into the avant-garde circles during the first half of the 20th century. And here we'll see a few more examples of that. Here we have Marie Laurencin. Her date's 1885 to 1956. And she was educated at the Lycée Laramin and the Academia Humbert. She had a long, stormy affair with the poet Giacomo Apollinaire, and her work has little to do with Cubism's concept and formal investigations, but her friendships and relationships with that group often puts her in this category. Instead, for her, it was her femininity that became the artistic yardstick against which her work was measured. She brought feminine art major status, claimed Apollinaire, but it was as his muse that she entered the modernism mainstream. She did exhibit alongside the Cubists in 1907 and from 1909 through 1913, but she's often seen as subordinate to Picasso, like most other Cubists were. And then we have the artist Florine. Her date's 1871 to 1944. Now, she also became better known for her friends than for her own artwork. She used her wealth and social position as a defense against art world intrusion, elaborating her notion of the feminine through wispy calligraphic paintings in which physical bodies were dematerialized and details of costume and accessories were exaggerated for effect. She was born in Rochester, New York, and was the youngest of 5 children in a very prosperous German Jewish family. She studied at the Art Student League in New York from 1892 to 1895, and then traveled to Europe with 2 of her sisters. There she took painting lessons in Germany, but the outbreak of war in 1914 forced the sisters to return to the United States. Now, the family home in New York soon became famous as the social center for a group of avant-garde art dealers, dancers, musicians, artists, and writers. Her unique personal style was evolved out of rigorous academic training, but her paintings focus almost exclusively on the social setting in which she lived, and you can see that in her work here on the right. She produced paintings as part of a self-consciously cultivated lifestyles which drew few, if any, distinctions between making art and living well. Protected from her wealth by having to exhibit or sell her works, she further insulated herself from the professional art world through her demand that any gallery who wished to exhibit her works had to redecorate the gallery like her own home. And that's going to bring us to Romaine Brooks, whose dates 1874 to 1970. Now, for Brooks, personal wealth also shielded her from having to exhibit and sell her works, but she did both. She linked her pictorial style to her environment with subdued shades of black, white, and gray that she chose for her palette. She's best known today as the first woman painter consciously to forge a new visual imagery for the 20th century lesbian. Now, she was American, but she spent most of her life in Paris, fleeing from the physical and psychological cruelties she'd suffered at the hands of both her mother and her brother. She met the wealthy American poet Natalie Barney in 1915, and the 2 women spent the rest of their lives in close proximity at the center of a community of women committed to producing serious art. Her first one-person exhibition took place at the prestigious Galerie Durand Ruel in 1910. The paintings that were exhibited were almost all of women and ranged from portraits to figure studies of unnamed models. The exhibition included paintings employing a restricted palette based on a range of gray tonalities. Now, she has often been marginalized in histories of modern art because of her decision to work primarily as a portraitist and because of her apparent disinterest in the stylistic innovations and movements that have defined the modernist avant-garde. The painting White Azaleas from 1910, which is on the left here, was the first of a series of paintings of slender, small-breasted reclining nudes that would prove as daring as Monet's Olympia from 1863 to 65 in their simultaneous eroticizing of the female body within the context of lesbian spectatorship and the repudiation of the conventions of the voluptuous female nude in Western art. Brooks' search to forge a new visual representation of the modern lesbian would lead her to a series of powerful images of Amazons and warrior women. These then led finally to the groundbreaking self-portrait of 1923 through a series of works that visually articulate the modern lesbian's relationship to contemporary medical literature on homosexuality, as well as to pictorial tradition that destabilized the categories of masculinity and femininity. And you see this self-portrait on the right here. The emergence around 1900 of a cross-gender figure whose behavior and or dress manifested elements commonly identified as masculine corresponded to an early 20th century medical model which constructed lesbianism around notions of perversion, illness, inversion, and paranoia. These theories did provide new models of artists and writers early in the 20th century, enabling women to break the asexual mode of romantic friendships through which 19th century women had expressed their relationships with one another. Meaning here we're seeing them being more open. Where we saw in previous chapters it was close friendships, here we're seeing romantic friendships. The imagery of the intellectually and physically powerful femininity and that of the lesbian new woman of the early 20th century intersect in Brooks' paintings, which rely on the imagery of cross-dressing. Combining the thematics of romantic independence and endurance and the sartorial signs of wealth and independence, Brooks produces a powerful female image. The possibility of gender mobility implied by the choice of ambiguous clothing styles has also characterized the dress of the dandy and the new woman. At a historical moment when radical feminists were advocating for androgyny and designers like Coco Chanel were masculizing women's fashions, the new look also began to make its presence felt in the visual arts. And that will bring us to Georgia O'Keeffe. Her date's 1887 to 1986. Now, she was an American painter, and her sexual ambiguity also defined her modernity. She spent much of her life trying to escape attempts by critics and well-meaning public to read her life into her works. Recently elevated to major status among 20th century artists, the rediscovery that began her meteoric rise to the forefront of American art came only with her retrospective exhibition at the Whitney Museum in 1970, when a new generation of viewers were drawn to the uncompromising example of her life and the quiet integrity of her work. She chose to live much of her life away from New York, developing her paintings in relation to the vast Astoria landscape of the southwestern United States, particularly around Abiquiu, New Mexico, where she moved permanently after the death of her partner Alfred Stieglitz. She studied anatomical drawing with John Vanderpool at the Art Institute in Chicago in 1905. In 1907, she was studying in New York at the Art Student League, but soon left to work as a commercial artist in Chicago. Her paintings of the 1920s are intensely personal statements expressed in the reductive language of early modernism. Her emergence during the early 1920s as an artist of great promise coincided with what appeared to be more liberal attitudes toward women, including their increased attendance in art schools. Throughout the 1920s, the complex association between her paintings of natural forms and the female body elicited readings which the artist herself recognized as ideological constructions. The idea of femininity, which presented O'Keeffe as Stieglitz's protege, and which constructed her considerable talent as essentially feminine, legitimized male authority and male succession. In a decade of declining birth rates, women were confronted by a barrage of literature urging them to stay home, where, as mothers and homemakers, they became perfect marketing targets for a new peacetime economy based on household consumption. Men were seen as rational, manipulating the environment for the good of their families, and women were intuitive and expressive and dominated by their feelings and their biological roles. Criticisms such as these constructed a specific category for O'Keeffe. Hailed as the epitome of emancipated womanhood, she was accorded star status, but only at the top of a female class. The biological fact of her femininity took precedence over serious critical evaluations of her work. And she also threatened to quit painting if Freudian interpretations continued to be made. So many of her works, such as the one I have here, which is the red canna, the flower paintings, often these were looked at as sexualized. They were looked at as representations of the female body, especially the reproductive organs, and she claimed that was not the case. And in fact, as I just said, she threatened to quit painting if these Freudian interpretations continued. She would compare and state that two other male artists' works, Hartley's and Demuth's, that their flower paintings were not interpreted erotically. She struggled against a cultural identification of the female with the biological nature of the body, which has long been used to assign women a negative role in the production of culture. So she's claiming that the two other male artists who are also making flower paintings, theirs are not looked at with this Freudian interpretation. Then we'll briefly mention the artist Emily Carr, 1871 to 1945. Her isolation in British Columbia saved her from most such intrusions. She did study briefly in San Francisco, London, and Paris. And what's interesting about her is she built an intensely personal style from a range of influences, and she distilled essential forms from a monumental and imposing nature and presented them without sentiment, moralizing, or antidote. And there's a few other women artists that are discussed in the chapter, and you can read that. But we're going to conclude by looking at Surrealism, the style of art Surrealism, and its impact. So no artistic movement since the 19th century has celebrated the idea of woman and her creativity as passionately as did Surrealism during the 1920s and 30s. None has had as many female practitioners, and none has evolved a more complex role for the modern artist in a modern movement. In Andre Breton's first Surrealist Manifesto of 1924, he dedicated himself to liberating women from such bourgeois considerations. The Surrealist women were also born out of Freud's ambivalent and dualistic positioning of woman at the center of the creative and the subversive powers of love instinct in her incompatible roles as mother and the bearer of life and the destroyer of men. The female body became the Surrealist signifier par excellence, the visual point of art, which the polarities of Western thought collapsed into a new reality. During the 1930s, women artists often came to Surrealism in large numbers, attracted by the movement's anti-academic stance and by its sanctioning of an art in which personal reality dominates. But they found themselves struggling toward artistic maturity in the context of a movement that defined their role as one as conforming and completing a male creative cycle, and that metaphorically obliterated subject-object polarities through violent assaults on the female image. Almost without exception, women artists saw themselves as outside the inner circle of poets and painters that produced Surrealist manifestos and formed Surrealist theory. Often they came to Surrealism through personal relationships with men in the group rather than shared political or theoretical goals. Yet, they made significant contributions to the language of Surrealism, replacing male Surrealists' love of hallucination and erotic violence with an art of magical fantasy and narrative flow. Their images of the female body, conceived naturally as other but as self, would fully emerge only with the feminist movements of the 1970s. However fantastic their imagery, they often work with the precision and care of illustrators, as if their creative model was scientific investigation rather than surrealist explosiveness. Women artists dismissed male romanticizing of nature as female and nurturing or female as destructive, and replaced it with a more austere and ironic vision. Alienated from surrealist theorizing about women and from the search for a female muse, women turned instead to their own realities. Surrealism constructed women as magical objects and sites on which to project male erotic desire. However, the women recreated themselves as beguiling personalities poised uneasily between the world of artifice, art, and nature, or the instinctual life. Works by artists such as Frida Kahlo, whose dates are 1910 to 1954, and you see her work on the left here. These works reinforce the woman artist's use of the mirror to assert the duality of being and the self as observer and observed. Kahlo used painting as a means of exploring the reality of her own body and the consciousness of its vulnerability. Turning to their own sexual reality as a source and subject, they were able to escape conflicts engendered by their flight from conventional female roles. Less than positive views of maternity also carry over into their work. The conflicts inherent in maternity, such as the physical changes initiated by pregnancy and lactation, the mother's exhaustion, and feared loss of autonomy, all appear in works. Here we see the first appearance of erotic violence in female surrealist work that was so prevalent in the male surrealist works. But here in the female works, it's dealing with childbirth and motherhood. Now it is violence directed against the self, not projected onto another. Violence inseparable from the psychological reality of women's sexuality and the social construction of her feminine role. Painting then became a means of sustaining a dialogue with inner reality. Surrealism sanctioned personal exploration for men and women, and in doing so, it legitimized a path already familiar to many women and gave new artistic form to some of the conflicts confronting women in the early 20th century artistic movements.